5 minutes to sort of cast our combined intellects, powerful intellects, over this question. Let me start with you, Nairi. If you were looking at Africa today, this year, maybe just more generally, what would, if you were to point out one thing that you think that's encouraging, what would that be?
I think I'd start with growth. I mean, if you take the World Bank's perspective, and if you take out Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, you find a continent that's growing faster than anywhere else. You find some of the fastest growing economies in the world. So yes, the three large economies have slowed down and face various challenges, although we heard some optimism about them this morning. I think growth. Second would be, we heard about the demographic boom in Africa. Most countries in Africa are doing really well on key human development indicators. Every single country has improved its child mortality, has reduced its child mortality rate. Most countries are doing really well on health, education. That bodes well for a demographic that can give more boom for growth. And thirdly, the perennial problem, African governments, like the British government, like the American government, have to start attracting the very best and brightest people into government. 50 years ago on the continent, the really smart people wanted to serve their country in government. And we've got to get back to there and find a way to do that. And sitting in a global school of government, I'm optimistic because I look at the caliber of the dozens of applications that we get from different African countries, and they are outstanding. It feels as though a tide is changing and that there are some truly exceptional future leaders that want to go into government.
Right. Just to challenge you on the education bit, the World Bank report came out recently that didn't make particularly happy reading for the sort of average level of education in Africa. You had kids that were behind Latin America, behind Asia significantly. We've got fast-changing job market. These people have got to find work. That didn't look too positive to me.
Okay, that's true. I mean, the good news is that most African countries have got kids into school, and the bad news is they're not becoming more literate than they used to be, even when they had less time in school. But that's a solvable problem. We're starting to learn what are the systemic things that you need to do. How do you make sure that the school system actually delivers literacy? And again, I'm not saying that next year we're going to see a leapfrog in literacy, but over the next 10 years, if we start applying the lessons of what's working on the continent to really improve literacy, because it really is improving in some schools, in some areas that are unlikely, then I think we can be optimistic there as well. But it's going to take focus, it's going to take entrepreneurship, but it's also going to take really great, innovative, responsive government. And that's why we need really great people in government.
Thank you very much. Donald, if I could turn to you. I'm basically going to ask the same question to each of the five of you to get going. But what looking across the continent, if you had to point to one thing that you think, that's good, we could build on that. That's a sign of hope.
Thank you, David. I think Nara made two excellent points. So I start from there.
Okay.
But two more issues I would like to point out. I think the Vice President and Mr. Dangote made two important points which should form our starting point. There's nothing exceptional about Africa.
Okay.
Africa is no longer an exotic market. We're just a market like any other, like Asia, like Latin America. And I think the idea that we discuss Africa in an exceptional way is part of the problem.
Right.
Okay. But two things I would point out now, and I'm going to begin with one which may surprise many people here, is that 35 years ago, we had Africa's first failed state, Somalia. How many people here today understand that Somalia is back to recovery? Malls are opening up in Mogadishu. Business is booming in that country. Not because of foreign aid, because of remittances, because of businesses like in telecommunication. And thanks to the efforts by African countries themselves to stabilize that part of Africa. I say this because too often people think the recovery of our continent is a function of foreign aid, foreign support. In this case, politically, militarily, it has been African countries. And in terms of investment, the Somalis themselves. I started with this so that we can level the ground.
Sure.
But in terms of what I think are the good news, look at this. Right now, between Djibouti and Addis Ababa, we have Africa's first electrified railway, about 700 kilometers. Between Mombasa and Nairobi, another high-speed rail. In Abidjan, they're about to do the first metro. Between these three projects alone, there is close to $9 billion.
Yes.
$9 billion. So there's been too much focus on the price of oil, price of copper, but not so much on what is going on in the long term, which will be the basis for our industrial base. So I think for me, these two issues have impressed me. To stabilize the continent,
yes,
because we're defined as a continent of conflict, it depends on the outside world, but here's Somalia coming back to life. And there is investment flowing into infrastructure, which I think is set to continue.
Yes, I think you're quite right to emphasize that instability is now the exception, not the norm, and even in a place like Somalia. The late, great Hans Rosling, I asked him for an investment tip, and he was talking about how business was going to move from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, and his investment tip was beachfront property in Somalia.
Yes,
so he was obviously ahead of his time.
He was.
Bernard, can I bring you in? The world of finance. What positive developments are we seeing, either generally or something that you could pinpoint from this year, again, that you would say there's a sign of something?
Yeah, if I can touch on what Nari said, because I'm a big believer in the human capital on the continent, and I completely agree that the quality of people that we see. I've visited Nari at her school a couple of times, and people coming in there, particularly wanting to invest in themselves for the governance piece of it, which is something that I think we've been lacking a little bit. And I and a bunch of us at my firm have also been investing a lot in university students across Ghana and Nigeria to start with, and actually we're getting more from East Africa, and they're coming in and doing internships alongside all the other regular universities that we recruit from across Europe, whether it's Oxford or Cambridge or LSE or Bocconi, etc. And you see these kids coming in age 20, 21, 22 and competing absolutely on par with the best educated elsewhere. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, we did a trip in Ghana and Nigeria with the team, and you go and you see the facilities that the universities onshore have versus what we have here, and you see the kids' ability to come and perform, and some of them have performed well enough to get jobs, etc. So that gives you a lot of confidence that actually at the low end there are issues, and we can talk later about some efforts being taken to tackle that. And at the higher end, you get very high quality kids that are able to, and they really are the future. In terms of finance, I would say, I think slow progress is what I would say. I think we are learning from our mistakes, which is important for every sort of economy and society. And we're all watching to see what has happened in the Nigerian context, to see if, my sense is actually, given the pain that they went through in 2015-16, there might be some gain. The Vice President talked about free floating exchange rates. Mm-hmm. One of the lessons from the Asian crisis was if you peg yourself to a fixed currency and you're not earning enough dollars, you've got trade and budget deficits, and you're constantly in a deficit situation looking for dollars, you're going to run into trouble at some point. And I think more and more economies are learning from that. And the other thing that I think is encouraging, you're seeing this a bit in Ghana and a little bit in Nigeria, they issued what's called a diaspora bond, where they tapped Nigerians abroad. And increasingly, some of these countries are tapping domestic savings, because actually there are decent pools of domestic savings. And if you can tap those, I think that's the most efficient use, using your domestic savings to drive your investments as opposed to somebody else's savings coming into your country. And then thirdly, that's a little bit slower, but I think more realizing that when you have high domestic interest rates, it's the impact, the cost of crowding out the private sector is so high. And I think that is a little bit slower than the rest, but that is coming through.
Right. Maletsi, can I turn to you? Lots been going on in South Africa. Some of it bad, but some of it good. What would you highlight as positive?
What about South Africa or South Africans? Well, for me, who lives in South Africa, I see a lot of positives about South Africa.
So do I.
Of course, the people who live outside and get reports from the likes of your
Especially from me,
newspaper get one side, which I used to be a journalist, so the bad story always sells. So a lot of people. Well, first about South Africa, I mean, the Vice President of Nigeria made a point in connection with South Africa, which was MTN. When I started dealing with Nigeria in the mid-90s, in the early 90s, actually, I was involved with the trade unions in South Africa, and we were protesting against the arrest of Yar'Adua, of Abiola, and so on. So we had a campaign as a trade union against the Abacha regime. Then to get through to Nigeria, it will take you anything up to 2 or 3 days. Today I can pick up my cell phone and phone Nigeria thanks to MTN, as the Vice President has pointed out. So we have new multinationals in South Africa like MTN, Vodacom, and so on. So there's a lot going on in South Africa. If you look at, for example, a few years ago, Nelson Mandela got sick, mainly to do with his old age. All the medical treatment he got in South Africa. He didn't leave South Africa to go to some other country to get medical treatment. It was our doctors who looked after him right up to the very end. Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, is another one of our icons in South Africa. He's not very well, he's getting old, but he's being treated by the medical community in South Africa. So for me, there's everything going right with South Africa. We have certain problems. Remember, South Africa is an old country. We're a country of nearly 400 years old as a modern country. So we have lots of inherited problems like mineral exploitation and what happens at the end of that. We have a mining industry that's over 150 years old, which has its positive and negative legacies. So we have to do those restructuring of our economy, the restructuring of the environment, the rehabilitation of the environment. I mean, one of our huge problems is acid water.
Right.
Because the mining industry, which has been on the go since the 1850s, wasn't concerned about the environment and the consequences of that. So we have these mega cleanups that we have to undertake in South Africa. But on the whole, I think South Africa is going in the right direction.
Well, let me ask you about the big question that you've only sort of subtly alluded to. I mean, state capture, Zuma, corruption, etc. But as we're trying to look at the positive side, I mean, there has been a positive side because there has been there's been institutional pushback from the judiciary, from the Public Protector's Office, from the central bank, which may or may not be under some kind of attack at the moment, and civil society more broadly. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that? Because it's very impressive to watch.
Yes, you see, South Africa, what has happened in the last 25 years or so has been the growth of what I call the African middle class. This has been a very, very profound change in South Africa. Before 1994, most of the middle class were white. Today, the majority of the middle class in South Africa is African, or black if you include colored and Indian. So what you're seeing in South Africa, if you look at the judiciary, the reason why the judiciary is so powerful in South Africa is because it represents the majority of the population. And it has the credibility with the population as a whole. It's the same with our media. The South African media today, a big part of it is owned by black South Africans. The largest newspaper group, which is independent newspapers, is owned by a gentleman called Iqbal Suve. So again, we have over 150 radio stations in South Africa. So the growth of the middle class, or the racial integration of the middle class in South Africa, means that our professions are very, very credible, first, with the population, but they have muscle also, because now they are part of the majority of the people. So issues like corruption, the judiciary has the credibility from the people to tackle the issues of corruption. But now, if I can just go a little bit of detail.
Just very quickly.
Okay. The corruption in South Africa, by the most pessimistic estimate, is about 2% of GDP. So we have to understand what we're talking about. Now, GDP of South Africa is over 4 trillion rands. So we're talking
small change.
So we're talking about small change. Secondly, the corruption in South Africa, on the whole, does not affect the private sector. It is civil servants and politicians stealing taxpayers' money. Now, that's hugely different, because if it impacted on the private sector, then it would be a serious threat, because it would block the ability of the private sector to operate. But stealing taxpayers' money, yes, it shouldn't be stolen, but in reality, the impact on the economic operation of South Africa is not that big.
Okay, I might have some disagreements with you there, but but we might go back to that, because I want to move on. Yao, you're Ghanaian, you're living in Nigeria. You may want to talk about either of those countries. You may want to talk about something else.
Well, I'll just look at the African continent and take the landscape. And I think to appreciate how far we have come, you have to take the view of a long-term investor, which is what we are. If you dial the clock back, say, 25 years, which most of the people I see in this room should be able to do that, but if there are people who can't, I apologize. Yeah. You encounter South Africa, which was under apartheid, Rwanda, which was in genocide, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, that was in civil war, Ghana, Nigeria, that was under military rule. I think you have to be able to do that to understand how far we have come. Yes. I'm not saying that governance today does not have deficiencies. It has a huge amount of deficiency, but the trend lines are in the right direction. Now, if you believe that the fundamental reason why modern society develops is that it is law-based, then Africa is headed in the right direction in that sense. As a result of increasingly law-based outcomes in Africa, you're seeing the population growth, which, if we lead and manage properly, should become a demographic dividend. And I think you are also seeing a decline in what I would call, for want of a better expression, ideological fundamentalism. I think an acknowledgement that the private sector has a role, that the market has a role, and that you need a competent state, and that they are not necessarily in competition. The reforms that the Vice President spoke about when he talks about doing business, etc., he's talking about institutional renewal. At the end of the day, a competent state. So you need, and they are complementary. You need a competent state that is able to secure law-based outcomes, secure the civil populace, give room for expression. You need a competent state that, as I always talk about when we talk about, because I believe that the major lever for social mobility in any civilization, not just in African civilizations, is education that is accessible, that enables people to have capabilities in order that they will achieve their full potentials. And when you look at that, regardless of sometimes the glitches that you see, the trend lines are in the right direction. The headlines may not be following yet, but the trend lines are in the right direction.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to the audience in a little bit, but I just want to pick up on something you said. Let's talk about politics, and no one's really mentioned politics. We've had a number of elections this year. Perhaps the most significant. I mean, earlier in the year we had the resolution of the Gambian crisis, and we had a leader who'd been there, Mr. Jammeh, for many years, who was eventually pushed out, partly because ECOWAS worked together to insist that he abide by the rules of the election. But we've had this very interesting situation in Kenya, and I'd be very interested to find out whether you think this is a positive. We've had the Supreme Court annul the election because it thought that the election was untransparent and that we couldn't be sure of the result. Maybe sure. Well, let me start with Donald, and then I'll come back to you. Donald, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I wonder why you're picking on me, but let me just...
You don't want me to pick on you.
but let me just say something else. Yes, there is a contest about that particular outcome. But Parliament in Kenya has been elected, accepted, is functioning.
Sure.
The provinces, or the counties, have been elected, accepted, they're functioning. Civil society is functioning, so is the private sector. So I do believe that from where they were 5 years ago, there have been incredible advance on democratic front. That is what's being perhaps ignored by many people. Parliament is functioning in Kenya.
Yes.
And judiciary is functioning. Now, there is a contest. There is a context in this country about a few issues. So I do think that it's normal democratic growth. I don't think there's anything exceptional there. We can all acknowledge the fact that there's no physical violence. There is a contest going on, which I'm certain will be resolved peacefully. I don't buy into these doomsday scenarios I've heard about Kenya. I just don't believe it.
Sure, I wasn't suggesting. I mean, I was actually suggesting that maybe that the decision of the court and the fact that both parties, albeit reluctantly, abided by it was actually something that...
Courts do make controversial decisions all over the world. I mean, here, I think there was a controversial Supreme Court decision on Brexit.
Yeah.
And I recall newspapers here crying, calling names the Supreme Court and all this. So there's nothing special about what's going on.
Right.
I'm saying
it was
to you
quite
that
special for, I mean, as far as I'm aware, it was the first case of this that had happened in modern Africa. And Nairi, what do you think?
Well,
I mean, do you think of this as a positive, or is it something that we should worry about? Or
well, I think it's a bit of a barometer on the way in which communications between governments and people have changed. That even a decade ago, in most countries of the world, most people looked to established news outlets, international experts, government leaders, private sector leaders, as an authoritative source of information, and that's reversed. 85% of people in most countries no longer do that. They look to their peer group and social network. And why do I say that? Because the lesson I take from Kenya's election is that there were real concerns throughout the election that different groups in Kenya were giving voice to. And I think the international election monitors and the outsiders that came in to monitor, they were slightly functioning on the 10 years ago view that because they're expert and high profile, it was enough for them to say, look, we can certify that this was fine and leave. And what I think we can all learn that they needed to be doing throughout the election and afterwards was saying, we hear these concerns. Here are the concerns that we're hearing around the country. Here is how we've actually investigated those concerns. Here is how we would respond to them in an absolute ongoing way. And they needed to make that communication viral and make sure that that was reaching everybody that had a concern.
Yeah.
Well, as you know, I lived in Kenya for 5.5 years. I cannot see how else I can conclude than to say that it is positive. The fact that with political dispute and fault lines, very threatening immediately after the elections, all sides, regardless of what they said thereafter, etc., all sides relied on the institutional mechanism for the resolution. And even if they had reservations have accepted the outcome, has to be positive for the Kenyan society. It's not too long ago that the society exploded in bloodshed over similar circumstances. Yes. So I see this no other way than to say that it's progress for the society.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I find Kenya very, very, very concerning, what is going on in Kenya. First, Uhuru and Ruto were charged by the International Criminal Court for actions against humanity. And they terrorized the witnesses at home so that their court case had to be dropped because of their terrorizing of the witnesses. That's point number one. Point number two, a week before the elections, one of the commissioners, a key person who was running the telecom, the ICT system, was murdered and tortured. And then a week later, we hold an election and we think it's free and fair.
Except the Supreme Court said it wasn't. I mean, that's
exactly.
That's the positive
That's why
outcome.
I'm saying there are lots of signs in Kenya that are very negative, that Uhuru Kenyatta and Ruto are perpetuating in that country, which can trigger mega violence in Kenya, and the world and the rest of Africa must say no. And these guys should be charged for what they did in previous elections.
But you have to well, let's see. We have to be careful here. I see between glorification and vilification, there's a middle ground. And the middle ground is democracy in Africa is growing in a very complex environment. We have to manage diversities. And I think that between those in government, those out of government, there are no devils and angels. We all have to accept that managing diversity is a challenge, whether it is South Africa, it is Kenya, it is Nigeria. And I don't think that the International Criminal Courts, whatever people think about it, many people in Africa have reservations about it. Many people in Africa who want justice, who don't want immunity, don't believe that is a place you will get justice. And this view is quite well spread. Just a little disagreement.
There is an African court, of course, which is now beginning to make judgments that are having effects around the continent. But
I was thinking, whilst you were asking the question, I was trying to run through my head which countries have gone backwards. By that, what I mean is, if you take a broad sweep of time, we all came through independence sometime in the 50s and 60s. We all, most of the continent. And then we went through periods of military dictatorship, broadly speaking, all big men, who sort of are taking their countries through independence and then sat there for a long period of time. And then at some point, very generalizations, but at some point with the Berlin Wall and Russia in the early 90s, we all sort of stumbled into some sort of democracy or change in rulers, etc. And if you go along that path, I was trying to think in my head which countries have gone backwards from that. And actually, very few I couldn't think of. I mean, Ivory Coast, I guess, with Hifikepunye dying, went into a civil war, but it's iterating itself to a better place. Nigeria is, Ghana is, Rwanda had its civil war, it is. Kenya lost its big man, it is. South Africa came out of apartheid, and I think the ANC will go through a bit like the PRI in Mexico, where the one party will slowly be challenged. So there might be one or two that I might not have thought of, but I don't think many have gone back to the military or back to a worse place.
I'd like to bring in the audience. Remember, the theme is kind of what might be working in Africa. No need to be rose-tinted about it. You can nominate a particular person in the panel you'd like to address, or the panel in its entirety. Gentleman here in the front. I think a microphone may make its way to you.
Thank you very much. My name is J.P. Bach from Back USA. I have a question to the panel. And the narrative of this summit is, as far as I understand, the renaissance of the Africa Rising. And the Vice President mentioned China, and nobody believed in China, and the same thing he quoted is what people think about Africa. We all know what happened when China became a member of World Trade Organization. They took all the manufacturing from the United States and the rest of the world and became very successful. Now, after many years, China is kind of not fading out, but they have their problems. The labor costs are too high and infrastructure is very difficult. So they are opening up for a new player. And I wonder if Africa in any way are focusing on manufacturing and maybe have a chance or want to enter that space and create the same business as China.
The manufacturing question is a good one. By the way, this isn't really an Africa Rising. I think it's subtly different from that. We want to look sort of cool-headedly what's going right and what's going wrong. But manufacturing is a very good thing to talk about. Maybe let's start with Moletsi, who I think you have ideas.
Yep.
You've thought about this a lot.
Yes, in South Africa, as the speaker has pointed out, we've been major casualties of Chinese manufacturing industry. our clothing and our textile and our footwear and many other industries in South Africa have been destroyed by the rise of China's manufacturing industries. Now, I'm not blaming China for it. A lot of it has to do with our own industrialists who were not modernizing their factories. It has to do with corruption, for example, in the customs duties where they were allowing goods coming in from China and other Asian countries without paying the proper customs duties. And there's a whole chain of these kinds of issues. As we heard from Dangote, the manufacturing industry in Africa is starting to rise. In South Africa, we are beginning to address all these problems, like the problems of the proper functioning of the customs officials and of the customs duties of the people who are supposed to protect the industries. We're also starting to address the question of financing, how to finance young entrepreneurs and so on. So the question of manufacturing in Africa is very, very, very central because you cannot develop an economy without manufacturing. There are many people who think you can just go into the service sector. In my own country, 50% of our working age population is not employed. Why is it not employed? Because first, to set up the mining industry, we destroyed peasant agriculture to force people to go and work in the mines. And then we have allowed our mining, whatever existed of our manufacturing industry, to be shredded by Asian competition. So there are lots and lots of issues that need to be addressed to restart the manufacturing industries. Nigeria. I mean, Nigeria used to be a major leather producer. What happened to their leather industry today? So these are all the issues that need it.
Donald, let me bring this in because it is a complex subject. We do have the beginnings of manufacturing in places like Ethiopia. Rwanda has a made in Rwanda, which I think is, serious. Obviously, it has its problems. It's a small landlocked country, but it's making an effort. But yet, overall, manufacturing has shrunk as a percentage of GDP if you look across the continent. Do you see flickers of change here, flickers of hope? Could all those jobs that are moving out of China, could a big percentage of them come to African countries?
Okay, so let me look at the part of the glass which is half full.
Sure.
Yeah. I saw Helen here.
Sure, she is indeed.
I'm sure she'll be talking more about manufacturing. But in countries which are getting things right, in terms of energy, in terms of logistics, in terms of facilitation like clusters, actually Chinese manufacturers, because of the differential in the real wages, are moving into those countries.
Yes.
So it is happening. But it is not preordained. There's also India, which they're looking at. And then there's, of course, artificial intelligence. And therefore, whether Chinese manufacturers will relocate to Africa is a function of what we do in terms of investment in energy, logistics, clusters, and above all, regional integration. Because if they come to one market of 10 million people, they're looking at the broader market. So it's what we do which will determine whether they compete with India. And of course, all of us have to face the challenge of robots, which, by the way, is real. But let me just, to finish off, I'm very, very encouraged by the links which China and Africa have established over the last 30 years. The two railways I've just mentioned to you, David, Djibouti to Addis, Mombasa to Nairobi. The Brits took maybe 11 years to build Mombasa to Nairobi, all right? The
Lunatic Express.
This one has been done in another 2 years.
Yes.
And so I think whether it is a bit of labor moving here and there, commodities here, but I think the inflow of investment, particularly in infrastructure, is transforming this continent, whether it is power plants, railways, highways. I forgot to mention, since I saw Isabella here, also they have done the Lobito to the border with Zambia. And I do think this is what will integrate our markets, which will ensure that we can attract investment. Globalization is what it is. I'm sure, as Ellen will tell you, shoes were first made here in Europe. Then Europe became less competitive. It moved to the US. From the US to Southeast Asia, the tigers, and then to China. That's what it is. That's globalization. So now it is coming to Africa. very soon maybe to go back to Europe because of artificial intelligence. But there's nothing abnormal happening between Chinese manufacturing and they need to attract those jobs both in Africa and I believe in Southeast Asia and India as well.
But Nairi, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I think there's three things that three very positive elements to China's relationship with Africa which need our focus. One is on infrastructure and the way in which it has such dramatic consequences, not just for growth, but also for human development. So the infrastructure case. The second is the long-termism of Chinese relationship building and investments. And the third is to really think about cities, which are going to be so important. You know, retrofitting Africa's big cities is going to be extraordinarily costly. China has a very contemporary experience of kitting out its cities, and I think is thinking about that. I think on the challenge side, I think the fact that China's overseas construction companies and such like have access to such cheap credit and implicit subsidies from their own government makes them hard to compete with for companies from the continent, and that's important. Obviously, the slowdown in China and the shift to a more inwardly focused economy and its own middle class could be a risk for Africa. So there's definitely, and there's some quality issues around some of the infrastructure, but I do think the lessons have been there, and just the opening up of a wider range of choices and models, which my fellow panelists were talking about, I think has been very important for the continent.
And the emphasis on cities, I think, is very important. We'd have a panel dedicated to cities later. But any particular countries? Ethiopia is often mentioned as a country that's beginning to get this right. Is that right, or would you mention some other places that are actually...
In terms of manufacturing?
In terms of manufacturing, I want to get back to the manufacturing question.
Well, East Africa is I think, in West Africa we've had ECOWAS for a while, and it feels as if they're getting some momentum in having that regional integration that I think Donald talked about. So I think that might give them some momentum. I worry, this is the panel which is supposed to be about everything that's working, if I can put a slight damper on
You're going to put a damper on
the party.
No,
and I think we're heading in the right direction, absolutely, but I think for that, you can have, I guess, small-scale sort of import substitution manufacturing, or you can have scalable manufacturing, and that infrastructure need, or the need to support that is what I worry about. And, you've got the governance issues, but the energy deficits that we have in some countries, and the rail infrastructures and the road infrastructures are things that I think we're getting there, but to get there at a reasonable cost so that, Solomon Yao at Unilever, so that he can, be as efficient as possible in terms of what he's manufacturing across the region. It's not easy, and the cost of, the reality is that the cost of, the street cost of a lot of basic goods in Africa is still higher than elsewhere in the world. Yeah. And we need to work on that.
Yeah, I think the final word's going to go to you.
So I'll underline some of the points that have been made. The migration of manufacturing location is usually driven by an economic logic. And it's important that if we want to attract our fair share of manufacturing in Africa, that's the primary consideration of policy, and that's the primary objective of policy. First, make the markets competitive so that people can manufacture rather than be driven by political sentiment of asking for our fair share. If we are competitive, as many people are talking about, but which we need to do more, then you will get your fair share. And I think Donald made the point. People didn't, the part of the reason why you're seeing the migration out of China is that with greater prosperity, wages have gone up, the economics of manufacturing in China, therefore relocating to more competitive places. So if we sort out some of the things that we've been talking about, educate the talent base so that they have capability, deal with the industrial infrastructure, ports, etc., so that you are competitive, and fundamentally ensure that you have a law-based environment, then we'll get our fair share. Yeah.
I'm going to end it there. I think it was a fascinating panel. I'm sorry to end it slightly abruptly, but we've got a coffee break now. We're going to come back for Moise Katumbi, presidential candidate in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think that was a fascinating panel. I think you've really set the agenda for the rest of today. If you could thank our panelists.